Worthless, she heard it again, louder this time, sharp enough to cut through the soft clinking of glasses and the low hum of laughter that filled the ballroom. And for a second, Sophie Bennett forgot how to breathe. The room was glowing in warm gold light, chandeliers casting soft reflections over polished marble floors. Every table dressed in white linen and crystal that probably cost more than a month of her rent, and yet none of it felt beautiful to her. Not when every eye seemed to tilt in her direction. Not when her name badge suddenly felt heavier than it should, like it was pulling her down into the ground. She stood there, tray balanced carefully in her hands, fingers steady out of habit even as her chest tightened, her black service dress pressed, but worn at the seams, shoes that pinched after 10-hour shifts, and she could feel it again. That quiet, familiar thought creeping in from the edges. Maybe they're right. I asked for sparkling water, not still, the woman in front of her said, her voice smooth but edged with something colder, something practiced, the kind of tone that didn't need to be loud to make a point. Sophie blinked, glancing down at the glass, realizing her mistake, a small one, barely worth noticing. But here, in this room, it felt like a crime. "I'm so sorry, I'll fix it right away," she said quickly, her voice soft, controlled. The way you learn it has to be when apologies become part of your daily language. The woman leaned back in her chair, eyes sweeping over Sophie from head to toe, not with curiosity but with judgment, like she was inspecting something she had already decided she didn't want. "Unbelievable," she murmured, loud enough for the table to hear, loud enough for the nearby guests to catch. And then came the word again, quieter this time, but somehow worse. Worthless. Sophie felt the heat rise to her face, not from anger, not even from embarrassment, but from that strange hollow feeling that comes when you've heard something too many times for it to surprise you anymore. Around them, conversations resumed, forks touched plates again, laughter returned like nothing had happened, because nothing had happened to them. To them, she was just background noise, a moving part of the evening, someone who existed only when she made a mistake. She turned, slightly, ready to step away, to disappear back into the rhythm of service where mistakes could be corrected and moments like this could be swallowed whole. But then something stopped her, not a voice, not a command, just a presence. At the far end of the room, near a column half hidden in shadow, a man sat alone, no entourage, no obvious sign of importance, dressed simply in a dark suit that didn't try too hard to impress, his posture relaxed, his gaze steady, and unlike everyone else, he wasn't looking past her. He was looking at her. Not at the tray, not at the mistake, not at the uniform, at her. Sophie hesitated for just a fraction of a second, long enough to feel it, that strange shift in the air, like something unseen had just changed direction. Then she lowered her eyes again, forcing a polite nod, turning back toward the service station, because that's what you do. You keep moving. You don't linger. You don't hope. You don't expect anything different. Still, as she walked, weaving through tables and polished conversations, she couldn't shake the feeling of that gaze following her, not heavy, not uncomfortable, just present. And for the first time that night, the word worthless didn't land the same way it usually did. Not because it hurt less, but because somewhere, quietly, without explanation, it felt like someone had just disagreed. The service hallway smelled faintly of coffee and detergent, a quiet contrast to the polished elegance just beyond the double doors, and Sophie moved through it quickly, her steps measured, her shoulders straight even though the weight of the night pressed harder with every passing minute. She set the tray down on the stainless steel counter, exhaling slowly as she reached for a clean glass, her fingers working on autopilot. Rinse, polish, repeat, the rhythm steady enough to keep her thoughts from unraveling completely. Table 12 needs sparkling. She reminded herself under her breath, her voice barely audible, like saying it out loud might somehow make the mistake smaller. Around her, other servers moved in practiced patterns, some glancing at her, most not, because everyone here had learned the same unspoken rule. Keep your head down. Do your job. Do not make yourself noticeable unless you want to be remembered for the wrong reasons. Sophie grabbed the correct bottle this time, checking the label twice, then once more, just to be sure, before placing it carefully on the tray. Her reflection caught briefly in the metal surface, and she paused, just for a second, long enough to see the tiredness she usually ignored, the faint shadows under her eyes, the tension in her jaw. And she almost laughed, not because anything was funny, but because it was easier than letting the other feeling rise. Worthless, she whispered, testing the word quietly, like she was deciding whether it still fit. And for a moment, it did. It settled into the same familiar place it always had, heavy but expected. But then, just as quickly, another thought pushed in, uninvited, unexpected, the memory of that man's eyes, steady, calm, not dismissive, not indifferent, just seeing. She shook her head lightly, as if to clear it, because thinking like that was dangerous. Hoping for something different always was, and she had learned long ago that hope could cost more than it gave. Balancing the tray again, she pushed the door open with her shoulder and stepped back into the ballroom, the warm light wrapping around her once more, the noise returning like a wave, and everything looked exactly the same, as if nothing had shifted at all. She made her way toward table 12, careful, precise, placing the new glass gently in front of the woman, her movements smooth, practiced, invisible. Sparkling water, Sophie said softly, her tone polite, neutral, giving nothing away, and this time the woman barely acknowledged her, already turning back to her conversation, as if Sophie had corrected herself back into acceptable existence. It should have felt like relief, like she had fixed the problem and restored order, but instead it felt empty, like erasing a mistake did not erase the way it had made her feel. As she stepped away, her path took her past the far corner again, and without meaning to, her eyes lifted, just for a moment, just long enough to confirm what she already somehow knew. He was still there, the same man, sitting quietly, untouched glass in front of him, watching the room with a kind of patience that did not belong in a place built on status and noise. This time, when their eyes met, he did not look away. He gave a small nod, almost imperceptible, not a gesture meant to draw attention, but one that carried. A quiet acknowledgement, like he had seen everything that had happened and chosen, silently, to stand on her side of it. Sophie felt something shift again, subtle but real, like a crack in something that had been solid for a long time, and she quickly looked down, continuing on her route, because she did not know what to do with that feeling, that unfamiliar sense that maybe, just maybe, she had not been invisible after all. The night stretched on, measured not by minutes, but by the steady cycle of trays lifted and lowered, glasses refilled, plates cleared, and Sophie moved through it all with quiet precision, her steps light, her presence carefully contained, as if taking up too much space might invite attention she could not afford. Still, despite her effort to disappear back into routine, she felt it again, that subtle awareness, like a thread pulling gently at her focus, drawing her attention back to the same corner of the room. He had not left. While tables turned over and guests rotated in laughter and conversation, the man remained, his posture unchanged, his expression calm, as if he was waiting for something that had not yet happened. Sophie tried to ignore it, telling herself it meant nothing, that people stayed for different reasons, that not everything had to connect to her. But the thought lingered anyway, quiet and persistent. As she passed by his table again, she noticed something new. His glass was still untouched, the condensation faint along the rim, and the realization made her hesitate just enough to feel it, that pull between staying in motion and choosing to stop. For a second, she almost kept walking, because stopping meant risk, meant breaking the invisible boundary she had learned to respect. But then she turned, just slightly, her steps redirecting before she could talk herself out of it. She approached his table with the same composed professionalism she offered every guest, setting her tray gently against her hip as she spoke. "Is everything okay here, sir?" she asked, her tone polite, even giving him the same respect she gave everyone else, even if she did not always receive it in return. He looked up at her, not surprised, not distracted, just present, like he had been expecting her to come over eventually. Up close, his expression was even clearer. There was no impatience in it, no judgment, just a quiet attentiveness that made it hard for her to look away for too long. "Everything is fine," he said, his voice low and steady, the kind that did not need to be loud to be heard. He glanced at the glass briefly, then back at her. "I just have not had a reason to drink it yet." Sophie blinked, unsure how to respond to that, because it was not the kind of answer she was used to, and for a moment, she felt that unfamiliar shift again, like the rules she had been following did not quite apply here. "Would you like me to bring you something else?" she offered, defaulting back to what she knew, to the script that kept things simple. He shook his head lightly. "No," he said. Then after a brief pause, he added, "But I would like to know your name." The question caught her off guard, not because it was inappropriate, but because it felt intentional in a way most interactions did not. Most people did not ask for her name unless they needed to file a complaint. "Sophie," she said after a second, her voice softer now, less rehearsed. "Sophie Bennett." He nodded, as if committing it to memory, as if it mattered. "Sophie," he repeated, and the way he said it made it sound different, not like a label, not like a tag, but like something with weight. "You handled that situation earlier with more grace than most people in this room." She felt her chest tighten slightly, not from discomfort this time, but from something harder to name, something that felt dangerously close to relief. "It is part of the job," she replied quietly, though even as she said it, she knew that was not entirely true. He studied her for a moment longer, then gave a small, almost knowing smile. "No," he said gently, "it is not." And just like that, with a single sentence, something shifted again, deeper this time, like a door she had kept closed for a long time had just been nudged open, not forced, not broken, just opened. For a moment, Sophie did not move, his words settling somewhere deeper than she expected, like they had found a place inside her that had not been touched in a long time, and she almost forgot where she was, the noise of the ballroom, dimming around the edges as if the world had quietly stepped back to give that moment space. Then the sound returned all at once, laughter rising, glasses clinking, someone calling for service across the room, and reality slipped back into place. She straightened slightly, nodding once, because staying too long at a single table was noticed, and being noticed was something she had spent years learning to avoid. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft but steadier now, and for the first time that night, the words did not feel automatic, they felt chosen. She turned to leave, but before she could take a full step, his voice followed, not loud, not demanding, just enough to reach her. "Sophie," she paused, glancing back over her shoulder. "Yes, sir," she replied, the formality slipping in again out of habit. He tilted his head slightly, a faint smile touching his expression. "You do not have to call me that," he said. "Daniel is fine." The name lingered for a second, simple, ordinary, nothing about it hinting at anything more, and yet the way he said it made it feel like an invitation rather than a correction. "Daniel," she repeated quietly, testing it the same way she had tested that other word earlier, but this one felt different, lighter, easier to carry. He gave a small nod, as if that was enough, as if nothing else needed to be said for now. Sophie continued on, her steps returning to their rhythm, but something had shifted in the way she moved, not outwardly, not enough for anyone else to notice, but internally, like a subtle recalibration she could not quite explain. The rest of the evening unfolded with the same demands, the same expectations, but she found herself responding differently, not in what she did, but in how she felt while doing it. When a guest waved impatiently, she still approached with calm professionalism. When a request came sharp and quick, she still answered with quiet efficiency, but the weight of it all seemed just slightly less suffocating, as if the space inside her had expanded by an inch, enough to breathe a little easier. Near the end of the event, as the crowd began to thin and the music softened, Sophie carried a tray of untouched desserts toward the side station, her arms tired, her feet aching in that familiar way that came after hours of standing, and she thought about the long walk home waiting for her, the dim streetlights, the small apartment that barely held together everything she was trying to manage. She set the tray down carefully, adjusting the plates with practiced care, when she noticed him again, this time standing, no longer hidden in the corner, speaking briefly with one of the event coordinators. The exchange was quiet, controlled, nothing dramatic, but there was a shift in the coordinator's posture, a subtle straightening, a respect that seemed to appear out of nowhere, and Sophie caught it without fully understanding why. Daniel turned slightly after the conversation ended, his gaze scanning the room once more before landing on her again, and for a second, it felt like everything else faded, not because the room had changed, but because her awareness had. He gave a small nod, the same quiet acknowledgement as before, and then he reached into his pocket, pulling out something she could not quite see from across the room, handing it to the coordinator before stepping away. Sophie watched, just for a moment longer than she should have, then looked down again, focusing on the plates in front of her, because whatever this was, it did not belong to her world. And yet, as she wiped the edge of a dessert plate, her hands steady, her movements precise, one thought surfaced again, uninvited but persistent, not loud, not certain, just present. Maybe this night was not over yet. The last guests lingered in small clusters, their voices softer now, conversations winding down into quiet goodbyes as the ballroom slowly exhaled the energy it had held all evening, and Sophie moved through the final stretch of her shift with the same careful focus, though her body ached and her feet burned with every step. She stacked glasses, cleared plates, reset silverware, each motion deliberate, efficient, familiar, but her thoughts were not where they usually were, not on the clock, not on how many more minutes until she could leave, but on something else, something she could not quite shake. That moment, his voice, the way he had said her name like it mattered. She tried to push it aside, reminding herself that nights like this ended the same way they always did, with tired hands, a long walk home, and nothing that truly changed. Still, when she glanced toward the entrance and saw that he had not left yet, something inside her tightened again, not with anxiety, but with a quiet anticipation she did not want to admit. She turned back to her station, reaching for a cloth to wipe down the counter, when she noticed a folded envelope resting near the edge, placed neatly beside the register, as if it had been left there with intention. It was simple, cream-colored, no decoration, no name written on the outside, and for a second, she assumed it belonged to someone else, that it had been left behind like so many other small things guests forgot in places like this. But then she heard her name. Sophie. She looked up to see the event coordinator approaching. Her usual brisk demeanor softened in a way Sophie had never seen before. "This was left for you," she said, gesturing toward the envelope, her tone careful, almost respectful, as if the object carried more weight than it appeared. Sophie hesitated, her fingers hovering just above it before finally picking it up, the paper smooth and slightly heavier than standard, the kind that felt deliberate, chosen. "For me?" she asked quietly, not because she had not heard, but because she needed to confirm that this was not some mistake, that it was not meant for someone else more important, more visible. The coordinator nodded. "From the gentleman in the corner," she said, and then, after a brief pause, added, "He asked that you receive it personally." Sophie's breath caught just slightly, her eyes dropping back to the envelope as the room around her seemed to quiet again, not completely, but enough that the moment stood apart from everything else. She traced the edge of it with her thumb, feeling the faint texture of the paper, before carefully opening it, her movements slower now, more cautious, as if whatever was inside might shift something she was not ready to face. Inside was a single card, thick, clean, with a name printed in simple, elegant lettering, Daniel Whitmore, and beneath it, a title that made her pause, her eyes reading it once, then again, as if her mind needed time to catch up with what it was seeing. Founder and Chief Executive Officer. For a second, nothing made sense. The name, the title, the man who had sat quietly in the corner, who had spoken to her without pretense, who had asked for her name like it mattered. And then the pieces began to align, slowly, like a puzzle she had not realized she was solving. Her grip on the card tightened slightly, her heart beating faster, not from fear, but from the sudden awareness that the ground beneath everything she thought she understood had just shifted. She turned the card over, her fingers unsteady now, and found a short handwritten note on the back, the ink clean and deliberate. "You were never what they called you," it read. "Come see me tomorrow, 9 a.m. There was an address beneath it, a location she recognized immediately, not because she had ever been there, but because everyone knew it, a place that belonged to a world far removed from hers. Sophie stared at the words, her thoughts racing, disbelief and something else rising together, something that felt dangerously close to possibility. Around her, the last of the lights began to dim, staff moving to close out the night, but she remained still, the card held carefully in her hand, as one question settled quietly in her mind, steady and undeniable. What if this was not a coincidence at all? The night ended, but sleep did not come easily, and Sophie lay awake staring at the faint cracks in the ceiling above her small apartment. The city outside humming softly through the thin walls, her fingers still holding the edge of the card, as if letting go of it might make everything that had happened disappear. The address printed beneath his name replayed in her mind over and over again, each time feeling more unreal, more distant from the life she knew. And yet the weight of the card in her hand reminded her that it was real, that it had been placed there intentionally, that he had chosen her, not by accident, not out of convenience, but with purpose she did not yet understand. She turned onto her side, pulling the thin blanket closer around her shoulders, her thoughts circling the same questions without answers. Why her? What did he see? And the most dangerous one of all, what if this was a chance? Morning came too quickly, the pale light slipping through the window before she felt ready, and for a moment she considered not going at all, staying in the safety of what she already knew, the routine that, while exhausting, was at least predictable. But then she looked at the card again, at the words written in steady ink, and something inside her, something small but persistent, refused to let her ignore it. By the time she stepped outside, the air was crisp, the kind that made you more aware of every breath, and she pulled her coat tighter as she started the walk toward the bus stop, the city already alive around her, people moving with purpose, unaware of the quiet shift happening inside her. The ride felt longer than usual, each stop stretching the distance between where she was and where she was going. And when she finally stepped off, she hesitated, her feet slowing as her eyes lifted to take in the building in front of her. It rose high against the skyline, glass and steel reflecting the morning light, the kind of place she had only ever seen from a distance, the kind of place that did not belong to someone like her. For a moment, she stood there on the sidewalk, the card held tightly in her hand, her heart beating faster, not from the walk, but from the realization that stepping inside would mean crossing a line she had never crossed before. She could turn around, she could pretend she had never received it, that none of this had happened, and her life would continue exactly as it had been. The thought lingered just long enough to feel safe, familiar, but then another memory surfaced, his voice, calm and certain. You were never what they called you. And it settled something inside her, not completely, not enough to erase the doubt, but enough to quiet it just a little. Sophie took a breath, steadying herself, and stepped forward. The lobby was quiet in a different way than the ballroom had been, not filled with noise, but with presence, polished floors, clean lines, people dressed in sharp, tailored clothes moving with confidence she did not yet have. She approached the front desk slowly, her voice soft but clear when she spoke. I have a meeting, she said, placing the card gently on the counter, her fingers lingering on it for a second before letting go. The receptionist glanced at it, then at her, and something shifted in her expression, subtle but unmistakable, a recognition that passed without explanation. Of course, she said, her tone changing, more respectful now, more attentive. You are expected. Sophie felt her breath catch slightly at those words, expected, as if this moment had already been decided before she even arrived. She followed the directions given, her steps measured as she moved toward the elevators, each second stretching the anticipation further, until the doors closed behind her and the quiet hum of ascent surrounded her. As the numbers climbed, she looked at her reflection in the mirrored wall, seeing herself the same way she had the night before, the same coat, the same tired eyes, but something else had changed, something she could not yet fully name. When the elevator finally stopped and the doors opened, she stepped out into a space that felt even quieter, more deliberate, and at the end of the hall, through a set of glass doors, she saw him. Daniel stood near the window, the city spread out behind him, the morning light outlining his figure, and when he turned to face her, there was no surprise in his expression, only that same calm recognition, as if he had known all along that she would come. For a second, Sophie could not move, her hand still resting lightly against the glass door, as if crossing that final step required more than just motion, as if it required a decision she was not sure she was ready to make. Daniel watched her quietly, not rushing her, not calling her forward, just standing there with the same calm presence that had unsettled her in a way she could not explain. Finally, she pushed the door open, the soft click echoing faintly in the otherwise still space, and stepped inside. The room was expansive but not overwhelming, designed with intention rather than excess. Clean lines, natural light pouring through the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city stretching endlessly behind him. And for a moment, she felt smaller than she had the night before, not because of anything he did, but because of where she was standing now. "You came," he said, his voice steady, almost certain, as if he had never doubted it for a second. Sophie nodded, her fingers tightening slightly around the strap of her bag. "I was not sure if I should," she admitted, her honesty slipping through before she could filter it. He gave a small nod, as if that answer made sense to him. "That is usually how it feels when something matters," he replied. The words lingered, simple but deliberate, and she found herself holding on to them longer than expected. There was a brief silence, not uncomfortable, but filled with something unspoken, until Daniel gestured lightly toward a chair across from his desk. "Sit," he said, not as an order, but as an invitation. Sophie hesitated for only a moment before stepping forward, lowering herself into the chair with careful composure, her posture straight, her hands resting in her lap to keep them from fidgeting. Daniel remained standing for a moment longer, studying her in that same quiet way, before finally taking his seat across from her. Up close, everything felt sharper, more real, the details of the office, the weight of his presence, the awareness that this was not a misunderstanding, not a coincidence, but something intentional. "Do you know who I am?" he asked, not with arrogance, not with expectation, but with a kind of curiosity, as if her answer mattered more than the fact itself. Sophie glanced briefly at the card she had placed on the desk earlier, then back at him. "I read the card," she said carefully, "but I do not understand why you asked me to come here." There it was, the question she had carried with her since the moment she opened the envelope, finally spoken out loud. Daniel leaned back slightly, his expression thoughtful rather than guarded. "Last night," he began, his voice measured, "I watched an entire room decide what you were worth in less than a minute." Sophie felt her chest tighten at the memory, the word echoing again in her mind, but she did not look away this time. "And you still chose to be kind," he continued, his gaze steady on hers. "Not once. Repeatedly." She swallowed lightly, unsure how to respond, because to her, it had not felt like a choice, it had felt like survival. "That is not something you can teach," he said quietly. "And it is not something you can fake." The room felt even quieter now, his words settling into the space between them, and Sophie felt that same shift again, deeper this time, like something inside her was being seen in a way it never had before. "So what is this?" she asked softly, her voice steady despite the uncertainty underneath. "Why am I here?" Daniel leaned forward slightly, resting his hands on the desk, his expression serious now, but not cold. "Because I am offering you a chance," he said. "Not out of charity, not out of pity, but because I believe you have something most people in this building do not." Sophie's breath caught, her mind racing to keep up with what he was saying, the words feeling too large, too unfamiliar to fit easily into her understanding of her own life. "And what is that?" she asked, almost afraid of the answer. Daniel held her gaze for a moment, then said simply, "Integrity." The word landed differently than the one she had heard the night before, not heavy, not diminishing, but lifting, expanding, and for the first time, Sophie felt something shift completely, not just a crack, not just a doubt, but the beginning of something she had never allowed herself to consider before. The word lingered in the air between them, quiet but undeniable, and Sophie felt it settle somewhere deep inside her. Not like the ones she had carried before, not like the ones that had weighed her down, but like something unfamiliar, something that did not hurt when it landed. Integrity. She had never thought of herself in that way, never framed her choices as anything more than necessity, survival, doing what needed to be done to get through another day. She lowered her gaze for a moment, her fingers tightening slightly in her lap as she tried to process it, to understand what he was offering without letting herself get carried too far ahead. "I do not have experience," she said finally, her voice steady but honest. "Not the kind you are used to. I have never worked in a place like this." Daniel listened without interrupting, his expression unchanged, as if he had expected that response. "I know," he said simply. "That is not what I am looking for." Sophie looked up again, searching his face for something she might have missed, some indication that this was a test she was failing without realizing it. "Then what are you looking for?" she asked, her tone quieter now, more careful, because the answer felt like it mattered more than anything that had been said so far. Daniel leaned back slightly, his hands resting loosely on the desk, his posture relaxed but deliberate. "People who remember what it feels like to be overlooked," he said. "People who treat others with respect even when they have no reason to. People who do not change who they are depending on who is watching." Each sentence landed with quiet precision, not overwhelming, but undeniable, and Sophie felt something shift again, not sudden this time, but steady, like something inside her was being realigned piece by piece. "And you think that is enough?" she asked, almost cautiously, because it sounded too simple, too different from everything she had been taught mattered. Daniel's expression softened slightly, not into a smile, but into something closer to certainty. "I think it is everything," he said. There was a pause, a moment where neither of them spoke, and Sophie realized that the decision he was offering was not just about a job, not just about stepping into a different world, but about whether she believed what he was saying, whether she could see herself the way he seemed to see her. "What would I be doing?" she asked after a moment, her voice steadier now, grounded in something she could hold on to. Daniel reached for a folder on his desk, sliding it toward her with a controlled motion. "I am starting a new initiative," he explained. "Community partnerships. Real ones. Not for appearances. Not for headlines. I need someone who understands the people we are trying to reach, someone who will not treat them like numbers or projects." Sophie glanced down at the folder but did not open it yet, her focus still on him. "And you think that person is me?" she said, not as a statement, but as something she was still trying to accept. Daniel nodded once. "I do not think," he replied. "I know." The certainty in his voice did not feel overwhelming. It felt grounding, like something solid she could lean against if she chose to. Sophie slowly opened the folder, her eyes scanning the first page, the details unfamiliar but not impossible, the language different but not unreachable, and for the first time, the gap between her world and this one did not feel as wide as it had before. She closed it gently, her hands resting on top of it as she took a breath, her thoughts settling into something clearer, something more focused. "If I say yes," she began, her voice steady, "I want it to be because I earned it, not because you felt sorry for me." Daniel did not hesitate. "Then we are in agreement," he said. "Because I do not offer opportunities out of sympathy." Sophie held his gaze for a moment longer, searching for any sign that this was anything other than what he claimed it to be, and when she found none, something inside her finally settled into place. Not perfectly, not without uncertainty, but with enough clarity to move forward. She gave a small nod, not dramatic, not hesitant, just certain enough to be real. "Okay," she said quietly. And in that single word, everything began to change. The decision did not feel loud. It did not come with a rush of certainty or a dramatic shift in the air, but it settled quietly, firmly, like something that had been waiting beneath the surface for a long time finally finding its place. Sophie walked out of the building later that morning with the same steady steps she had always carried, but everything around her felt slightly different, not because the city had changed, but because she had. The glass doors closed behind her with a soft click, and for a moment she paused on the sidewalk, the folder held carefully in her hands, the weight of it both real and symbolic, something tangible she could hold on to as proof that the past few hours had actually happened. People passed by her in both directions, their lives moving forward in familiar patterns, unaware that for her, something fundamental had shifted. She looked down at the folder again, her fingers brushing over its edge, and for the first time, she did not feel like she was holding something she did not deserve. She felt like she was holding something she had chosen. The days that followed were not easy. They were not effortless transformations or instant confidence, but they were different in a way that mattered. The first time she walked back into the building as an employee instead of a visitor, she felt the same awareness of her surroundings, the same contrast between where she came from and where she was now, but it no longer felt like a wall she could not cross. It felt like a space she was learning to navigate. There were moments of doubt, moments where conversations moved too quickly, where expectations felt higher than anything she had known before. But each time, she returned to the same steady place inside her, the one that had carried her through every difficult shift, every long night, every moment she had chosen to keep going when it would have been easier to stop. Weeks passed, and slowly, quietly, she began to understand what Daniel had seen. It was not in grand gestures or dramatic moments, but in small decisions, the way she listened when others spoke, the way she noticed things others overlooked, the way she treated every interaction as something that mattered, whether anyone was watching or not. One afternoon, standing in a community center filled with people whose stories felt closer to her own than anything she had encountered in the office, Sophie found herself explaining a new program, her voice steady, her words clear, and for the first time, she did not feel like she was out of place. She felt like she belonged exactly where she was. Later that evening, as the sun dipped low and the city softened into quieter tones, she returned to the office to finish a report, the building nearly empty now, the same stillness she had felt the first time she stepped into Daniel's office settling around her again. She paused at the doorway, noticing him standing by the window just as he had that morning, the city stretching out behind him, unchanged and yet somehow different. "How did it go?" he asked without turning, his voice calm, familiar now in a way that no longer unsettled her. Sophie stepped inside, closing the distance with quiet confidence. "It went well," she said, and this time, there was no hesitation in her voice, no uncertainty hidden beneath the words. Daniel turned then, his expression softening slightly as he looked at her, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, because there was nothing that needed to be said to confirm what had already become clear. Sophie held his gaze, steady and sure, and then, almost without thinking, she smiled, not the careful, polite smile she had learned to wear, but something real, something that came from a place she had once believed did not exist. "I think I understand now," she said quietly. Daniel tilted his head slightly, a hint of curiosity in his expression. "Understand what?" he asked. Sophie took a small breath, her fingers relaxing. At her sides, her posture open in a way it had never been before. "You were not changing my life," she said. "You were showing me it already had value." The words settled into the space between them, simple but complete, and Daniel gave a small nod, as if that had always been the point. Outside, the city lights began to flicker on one by one, and inside, Sophie stood a little taller, not because the world had finally seen her differently, but because she had finally seen herself that way too.